Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Today is Thursday, April 18th. If you're watching us on the recorded YouTube channel, and if you are here with us live, so happy you're with us. We are studying Tractate Pesachim, which is the Babylonian Talmud, Seder, Moed, meaning the order of one of the 6 orders of the Talmud that concerns festivals, seasonal observances. Pesachim, of course, is about Pesach, or it's the plural of Pesach, so it means Pesachs, all of the jots and tittles pertaining to how Pesach is observed. Last week, if you're back this week, that's good. It means I didn't completely lose you last week. Last week was kind of an exercise in esoterica, where we thought we were going to be talking about the subject of apportioning the lamb among households and how a newlywed bride, a new wife, makes the difficult choice about whether to observe Seder or observe Pesach with her new husband and his household, or with her household of origin in her father's home. And that led us into a kind of excursion down erotic poetry lane, as we looked at a few passages from Song of Songs. It did occur to me also something that I failed to mention. Song of Songs is customarily read at Passover time. Because the imagery of the Song of Songs, which of course is Tanakh, it's biblical literature, the imagery is springtime, right? Everything is blossoming. And that is, I would say, a literary convention in a lot of love poetry. You don't have a lot of romantic love poetry that is set in the bleakest, stormiest time of winter. So flowers are blooming, and so is young love. And so the fact that you have this Pesach passage that goes into Song of Songs, well, maybe there's another connection. But I'm the first to tell you that I found the connections to be tenuous last week. And from there, we talked about one of the great love stories gone wrong in the Jewish tradition, which is the prophet Hosea, who is commanded by God to take a wife who is a prostitute and have kids with her, only to be betrayed by her, as a kind of grim object lesson in faithlessness, which allows God to say to the Jewish people, see how I feel? This is what it's like every time you say you're loyal to me, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, and then you go and worship the Baalim, the Canaanite gods. It's like I married you at Sinai, and you can't help but break the covenant. So that's interesting, but I did realize after talking about it that maybe you had a reasonable question at the end of our study, like, that's nice, Rabbi, what does it have to do with Passover? So today, we get back to Passover. And we're going to look at the very end of Tractate Pesachim, and this will probably be a study that continues after Passover. So even though it was on my calendar, but we're not meeting next week, I'm traveling, and you'll still be digesting matzah, and I'll be in a different time zone. And I've had problems trying to conduct class from hotel rooms before, so I think that we should just take next week off, enjoy Pesach, and we'll resume the first week of May. And Natalie will reinforce this with a reminder message. So what I'd like to do today is go into Pesachim, Tractate Pesachim, Daf, or page 114a. And let's see how far we get into Pesachim 114. So I'm going to bring that up on screen right now. Nope, I'm not. I used to be like Zoom master during the pandemic, and now I'm rusty. So, okay, bear with me. I have to call up the tab. So we're picking up kind of near the top of Pesachim 114a. And this is a Mishnah, so you can see the big boldface matane. which means it was taught in the Mishnah. Mataneh is just the Aramaic form of teaching in the Mishnaic. Mazgulo kos rishon. So we're now really starting, as you see in Steinsaltz's gloss, the Tana, meaning the reciter, the Mishnaic teacher who was recounting the oral tradition, is how we are to understand the word Tana, the master teacher or master reciter, is now going to describe the beginning of the Passover Seder. That's not actually in the text. You can see only the boldface is what the text says. Everything else is Adin Steinsaltz's gloss. And God bless the memory and the soul of Adin Steinsaltz, the greatest Talmud commentator of our lifetimes. Mazgulo kos rishon. So kos rishon, the end of the sentence, is something that's probably easy for us to figure out the Hebrew. Kos is a cup, and Rishon means the first. Like you can even see the word Rosh inside of Rishon. There it is, right? Forget about the vowels. There's Resh, Aleph, Shin, Rosh. So the Rosh cup, the first cup. We know that Pesach, we drink 4 cups. We actually have 5 cups present, the 5th one being designated for Eliyahu Hanavi, for Elijah the prophet. So we start the Seder. It says mazgulo. Mazgu it literally means to mix or to stir. So they mix for him the first cup. In the time of the Gemara, in the time of the Rabbinic Commonwealth, wine was apparently too strong to drink undiluted. So the wine that was in casks would be decanted out and mixed with water to create the proper strength of wine for drinking. Okay, so when the Mishnah refers to preparing a cup of wine, it actually tells us that you would mix the wine, which means you would mix it with water to serve it at the proper strength. So they would mix for him the first cup. Beit Shammai omrim. So this is going to be a classic Mishnah that the minute you have Beit Shammai introduced into the conversation, you know that we're going to get a Hillel. We also, like, just refreshing our memory on Beit Shammai, can somebody recall out loud and go out on a limb and say, what should we expect about Beit Shammai's conclusions vis-a-vis Hillel's conclusions? Mom and Dad.
They're going to be wrong.
Right. Good. So
I would say not accepted.
Or not accepted. Right.
Not accepted.
Good. So that is actually going to be a lot of what we're talking about today. It's not just Beit Shammai being wrong or not the accepted opinion in the halakha, but also the why. Like we're going to get into, well, wait a minute. What specifically is not acceptable or wrong about Beit Shammai's argument? That's what I want us to be thinking about as we proceed. Okay, so Beit Shammai, sorry, I need to see, hello. All right, Beit Shammai Omrim. So the house of Shammai declares or says, Mivarech al hayom ve'achar kach mivarech al hayayin. Mivarech from Baruch, one blesses over the day, and afterwards, achar kach, mivarech al hayayin. You bless over the wine. Okay. Most of us are familiar just from practice with the custom of Kiddush. Kiddush literally means to sanctify. Kiddush. It's from Kodesh or Kuf Dalet Resh. Kuf Dalet Shin is the root. Kaddish, same root. Kedusha, same root. Kiddushin, which means marriage or wedding, same root. And on and on and on. So it's a familiar term to most practicing Jewish people. The premise of a Kiddush is that you are sanctifying something. And typically, a Kiddush is recited over a cup of wine because it is a celebratory occasion, right? So you lift up the wine and you say your Kiddush. Now, normally on a Friday night, Kiddush is made up of 2 blessings, a short and a long. The short one is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. And what we're going to study in Pesachim in this page is applicable not just for the Kiddush of Pesach, but it's also applicable for the Kiddush of Shabbos, the Kiddush of Sukkot, like the Kiddush of Sukkot, Pesach, any Jewish holiday. this will be applicable. So just think about Friday night Kiddush, right? Imagine that you're sitting in the pews at Westchester Reformed Temple, and the cantor takes the Kiddush cup at the end of the service, and everybody's mouth is watering because you want to get to the oneg. And she starts, and you're praying, please let it be the short Kiddush tonight. That maybe not. Maybe you're into the whole long Kiddush, but you're just hoping, like, please let it be the short Kiddush, in which case your wish will be granted if cantor chants Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen l'chaim, go eat. Now the problem is you haven't actually made a kiddush. You've only blessed God for creating the fruit of the vine, right? Think about the words Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Blessed are you, sovereign of the world, creator of the fruit of the vine. Okay, that's the blessing over the wine that Shammai is referring to. But if it's not your lucky night and you're starving and you want the oneg, but cantor decides it's really time to break out the full Lewandowski Kiddush, without interruption, the cantor will continue. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava. And it's a whole long Gansa Megillah about sanctifying the day, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav, the one who has sanctified us through mitzvot. So you even have the word kiddush baked into the first verse, and the rest of it goes on to say, we bless you, God, for sanctifying the Sabbath day and making it holy. That's what the big paragraph is, and that's why when we say make kiddush, you kind of need that paragraph because the first line borei pri hagafen is not even a kiddush. The whole thing together is usually referred to as the Kiddush, but as Shammai is pointing out, it's actually made up of two separate blessings. Borei pri hagafen, which is over the wine, the blessing over the wine, and al hayom, over the day, right? Two blessings, put them together, we call it Kiddush, but only the second paragraph makes it a true Kiddush. Sidebar, learn to correct yourself when you refer to somebody making Kiddush as blessing the wine. We don't bless the wine. We don't bless anything other than God in the Jewish tradition. Sometimes we invoke God to bless people, but you can't bless a substance. So making motzi, you're not blessing the bread. The bread was bread before you said the blessing. It's bread afterward. It's not blessed bread. And the wine is not blessed wine. It's not transubstantiated. You are blessing God over the wine or blessing God for the wine, right? So I correct, because this is a very common error, and to me, it's not actually a picayune little thing. It's a big deal because it actually is the big difference between Jewish and Christian practice. Like holy water is water that has been blessed. Wine for communion is wine that has been blessed. Like we're not doing anything to the substance itself. We're just saying, thanks, God. We love this stuff. Okay. You with me on this digression? Okay, let's get back to Shammai. Shammai says, you bless al hayom. That's where my cursor is floating here. Ve'achar kach mevarech al hayayin. So first you bless the day, over the day, and then you bless over the wine. And even the Hebrew preposition al, over or for, is here. Okay. Uveit Hillel omrim, but the house of Hillel says mivarech al hayayin v'achar kach mivarech al hayom. And Steve and Doug both know that Hillel prevails, right? And that is in fact what we do. If Cantor got up there at the end of Friday night service and started with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, everybody like, wait a minute, you forgot to say the Borei Pri Hagafen. That's the most important thing, right? Well, if she were a Shammaiite, maybe she's just doing it Shammai's way. But of course, we don't do things Shammai's way, which is why Hillel gets his name on the colleges. Okay. So this is the debate that's set up in the Mishnah. Let's see where this leads. Back to sharing the text. All right, so now you can see the Gimel Mem here with the little chupchik, the little apostrophe afterward. That stands for Gemara. So now we're leaping forward in time to hear what the Gemara says. The rabbis of the later strata of the Talmud have to say. Tanu Rabbanan. Well, The Gemara actually says we have another Tanaitic teaching. This not from the Mishnah, where they always use the word matane for designating a Mishnaic teaching. Tanu, which is from the same root, you can probably tell, is another word that means teaching, but from the Tosefta, which is another additional compendium of rabbinic teaching contemporaneous with the Mishnaic period. So our rabbis taught, Divarim sheben Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel basu'uda. So we're going to talk about Divarim, things or matters, sheben Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel, that pertain between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, with regard to meals. A su'uda is a meal. So the rabbis are going to bring some teachings that have to do with the differences between how Shammai and Hillel provide halakha, Jewish law, for meals. Beit Shammai omrim, so Beit Shammai says, and I'm going to interject here, it is a general principle that mivarech al hayom v'achar kach mivarech al hayayin. So not just on Pesach, the Gemara is making it clear that at any mealtime, if you're doing sanctifying, you sanctify the day first and afterwards the wine. That's the Shammai position. We know it won't be the accepted opinion, but that's his position. Mipnei means because, or on account of the fact that. So mipnei is a word that that sets up an explanation. Shahayom gorem layayin sheyavo. Literally, that the day is what causes the wine to be brought. In other words, the fact that it is a special day is the reason we have wine in the first place. We wouldn't be making a Kiddush if there weren't a day to sanctify. Therefore, the day has priority, right? The day takes precedence over the wine. The day is the root cause of doing a Kiddush in the first place. So that's Shammai's logic. The day is primary. The wine is being brought on account of the day. So you bless over the day first, and then you bless over the wine, and then you drink. Uchavar kidesh hayom va'adayin yayin lo ba. And he says, he adds an additional reason, which says the day has already been sanctified and the wine has not yet come. In other words, this is presuming that we're already celebrating the day even before the wine is brought to the table. The day is the day. Wine, like the day happens just because, it's Pesach, whether it's like a tree falls in the forest, right? Does it make a sound even if no one's around to hear it? My answer is, yeah, of course it does. Right? The day just happens. It's Pesach whether you're sitting at the table or not. So the day is happening even before the wine is at the table. So his point is that the day is the thing. The day happens involuntarily, as it were. The wine you actually have to make a choice to bring. Therefore, the day is primary. The wine is secondary. You bless over the day first, and then you say thank you for the creator. Thank you to the creator of the fruit of the vine. Okay, thoughts, questions, comments. Mom and Dad's hand, please.
The fact that you have said Shachrit blessings in the morning, does that sanctify any day? Does that mean that because you prayed this morning or it said Shema, whatever, that the day is sanctified to start with?
In this case, no. Particularly, just think of Pesach, because Shacharit on the morning leading up to Seder is not the same day, because Jewish days begin at sundown. So technically, a Seder is not, most of us will probably start our Sedarim, since Pesach is really, really late this year, and we're all living in daylight savings time. The sun's not setting until like 8 o'clock these days. So most of us don't want to wait till 8 to start Seder, but our Orthodox friends will. Like strict Orthodox Jews will wait until the traditional, 3 stars in the sky. It's basically the same timing as making Havdalah. So you can't say that it is Pesach until it's actually Pesach. So the Shacharit that you davened at Shul next Monday morning, Seder's on Monday night, is immaterial to sanctifying the day of Pesach. What they're saying is it's the sunset itself that brings the day, and then you perform the ritual by bringing wine to the table. So but it's all about the evening. So by day, we actually mean sunset. Okay, great. All right, so moving forward, So the nice thing about Mishnah, by the way, and even Gemara, is sometimes it's actually pretty easy. And Shammai often premises his arguments on strict logic, which I love, by the way, because I think that even if there wasn't ever a real Shammai, and there is some conjecture that these are mere rhetorical devices, that it's sort of like setting up a logic argument, it's very persuasive to this reader that Shammai's argument, the argument that Shammai is making is persuasive, at least to me. It's like, that's good. That's really logical. And sometimes in order to figure out where Hillel's coming from, you actually have to be willing to go, I wouldn't say defy logic, but you have to be willing to go beyond the logical to figure out why the rabbis so frequently favor Hillel, who often does not rest his arguments on logic with the kind of stringency that Shammai does. And stringency is a quality associated with the house of Shammai, whereas openness or liberalism is more associated with the quality of the rulings of the house of Hillel. So some of this is not just about the airtightness of the argument from a logic standpoint. There's a favoring of Hillel for reasons that go beyond how unimpeachable his logic may or may not be. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Like, the reason that Hillel is venerated above Shammai, and the reason his opinions are accepted way out of proportion to the opinions of Shammai, which are almost never accepted, there are some exceptions to that rule, have less to do with logic and more to do with some other qualities of the way Hillel argues his case. Okay, so, well, let's see what those are, because we haven't really heard what Hillel's argument is here. Okay, Uveit Hillel Omrim. So the house of Hillel says, Mivarech al hayayin, first you bless over the wine, v'achar kach mivarech al hayom, and then you bless over the day. Well, we all know this to be true because we've heard Kiddush before. Mipnei, because shehayayin gorem lekiddush shete'amer. It is the wine itself that causes the Kiddush to be recited. In order for this to make sense, you need to know that you're supposed to make Kiddush over a cup of wine. You're not just supposed to make an open declaration, bless God because it's Shabbat, or bless God for Passover, or bless God for any other sacred occasion. You do it over a cup of wine as if to suggest that today is special. Today our joy fills our cup. And so Hillel's argument is that, wait a minute, you're not actually allowed to make Kiddush without wine. There is an exception. What if you are too poor or cannot afford wine, or wine is not accessible? And the halakha, I don't think it's in this text, elsewhere rules that a poor person can even use a scrap of bread. But you have to make Kiddush over something that represents bounty, nourishment, abundance, joy, even a modicum. Okay? Following. So Hillel's basically saying, wait a minute. We wouldn't even be making a Kiddush if we didn't have the wine. So the wine actually should come first in the order of blessings. Here's his further argument at the bottom of the page. Davar acher. Here's another argument. I love it. Davar acher is a very important phrase. I'm sure we've seen it before, but it literally means another thing. Or here's another way of interpreting this, a secondary explanation. Birkat hayayin tidira uvirkat hayom eina tidira. So the birkat hayayin, the blessing over the wine, is regular. Uvirkat hayom eina tidira. Whereas the blessing over the day is irregular. So in other words, anytime you have a cup of wine, and if you're the kind of person who, like me, it just enjoys a glass of wine with a meal, not only on Shabbos, like last night, got home from work, poured myself a really nice, I have this Spanish white that I was drinking, a Godeo, which is kind of a really nice Spanish grape, pour myself a glass of wine, and I would sit down to say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. I'm not going to sanctify the day because it was a Wednesday night in White Plains. So the point is that Hillel is saying, wait a minute, there's a secondary reason why the blessing over the wine comes first. Wine is a regular thing that we drink, whereas blessing a day is irregular because we only do it on special days. And in this case, we're thinking about the Seder, so he's thinking about once a year. You bless over the Seder. So, and in Jewish practice, the regular trumps the irregular. Now, I hate the word Trump these days. Sorry. The regular overrides the irregular. Now, this is interesting because we often assume it's the other way around, right? The irregular should override the regular because the irregular is special. And Jewish practice, at least in the Reform community and the non-Orthodox community, bears this out. We make a very big deal over holidays, right? And so we think that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover are more important than Shabbos. But you've probably heard somewhere along the way, maybe even in religious school, maybe your kids or grandkids were taught this, that actually Shabbat is the most important holiday of the year. But maybe nobody explained why. And this is the reason why, because there's a Talmudic dictum, there's an axiom that the regular is more important than the irregular in Jewish life. That which you're doing every week is more important than something you do once a year, which has a certain internal logic to it, does it not, right? It's so important that I have to do it every week. Whereas Passover is, 1/52nd as important because I only do it once a year. It's 1 week out of 52. Therefore, it must be less important. It's again, it's not how we think because we make a big simus over the holidays. And we don't even, and Shabbat observance is much lower than Pesach observance among American Jews, for instance. Pesach observance, even among Jews who call themselves secular or non-observant, is still pretty high. Like a lot of Jews who don't have much connection to the Jewish tradition suddenly become very Jewish over Passover. Like I know people who never come to Shabbat services, but who insist on 8 days of only eating matzah. I call them matzachists. So anyway, all right, Judy Gross, your hand's been up for a while.
Bad.
Yeah, it is terrible. Sorry.
My question is about Shabbat. From the beginning, the day we bless the candles and it's Shabbat, and then we drink them when we have the wine. So how does this?
Yeah, so this doesn't even get into the candle blessing. This is really only over what we call making Kiddush, right? Making a Kiddush. The candles actually, though, is a good point because that's the formal declaration that the time is here.
But when the time is here, Shabbat is here, whether you bless the candles or not, the day is here.
Correct. And so the language of the candle blessing is instructive. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu. Okay, so we know it's going to be a blessing. It's a kiddush already of sorts. Asher kiddushanu, but the kiddushanu means God has sanctified us. We're not yet sanctifying anything. But mitzvotav, God has sanctified us through sacred acts, through mitzvot. Vitzivanu, specifically commanding us, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, to kindle the lights of Shabbat. Some of this may simply be that kindling the lights of Shabbat is sort of like starting a clock, right? It was a utilitarian act as well because no fire is to be kindled during Shabbat. So you kindle fire, which was utilitarian light, right? You turn the lights on in your house that you're not going to be able to turn off or on during Shabbat. So you kindle the light and then you say the blessing and then it's Shabbat, no more making fire. Right? So all that you've done with the kindling of light is saying, ladies and gentlemen, it's Shabbat. Then you do a Kiddush. And the Kiddush is then you sanctify the Shabbat. You've announced that Shabbat is here through the making of fire, but until you actually say Kiddush, this mashup of two blessings, one over the wine and one over the day, you haven't yet sanctified the day. You bless God, but you haven't sanctified the day. So that's the point. So we're really only talking about the middle of the three prayers on a standard like Friday night ritual. Candles, Kiddush, Motzi. Now in Pesach, we're going to see there are lots of blessings in between before you get to Motzi. Right? There's a whole ritual that you have to go through, and that's what this part of the Talmud is going to get into. All right, great. So let's see where Hillel goes. So Hillel's now given us two arguments. First, we wouldn't be making a Kiddush without the wine in the first place, one. Argument number two, in Jewish tradition, the regular, God, I'm sorry, did you just see those balloons go off? This is ridiculous. There's all of this motion capture stuff on Zoom, so apparently if I just want to tell you that I approve, I do this and I hold it there for a few minutes and then my thumb pops up. Or these days you can now, this is only if you've updated your Zoom to the most recent. I do this, hey, I'm raising my hand, I'd like to be acknowledged. And now I didn't even know this. I was making a sign of the number 2, and apparently balloons go off. Well, that's dumb. Okay. Sorry. Technology, useless technology. All right, so argument number 2 from Hillel is that the regular overrides the irregular, or the regular takes precedence over the irregular. It doesn't override it. The regular takes precedence over the irregular in Jewish life, and because drinking wine is a more regular activity than sanctifying a day, you say the wine blessing first, then you say the day blessing after. All right, that's the Hillel version of Kiddush. And from here, the text continues. Yeah, when a frequent practice and an infrequent practice coincide, the frequent takes precedence over the infrequent. The Tosefta concludes, and the halakha is in accordance with the statement of Beit Hillel, which, if you were paying attention to Steve or Doug at the beginning of class, you knew was coming. But you didn't even need my dad or Steve to say so, because you're smart people and you know that Hillel is the one whose name gets on the colleges, so of course Hillel's going to be right. Or you've just done Kiddush so many times that you know that the wine blessing comes first. All right. You would think that the Gemara could just let this go at this point, but of course it can't. The Gemara has more to say. So my davar acher, in literally, what's with this davar acher? Why do we need a second argument? Like, is it not persuasive enough that the argument that without the wine we wouldn't be making a Kiddush in the first place, which is Hillel's primary argument, is that not sufficient to make the case? Okay, v'chitema hatam tarte v'hachahada. Literally, it says, if you say that over there, v'chitema means over there, or tema hatam, tarte, there are 2, v'hachahada, chada is like echad in Aramaic. We're in Aramaic here, if you didn't pick that up. Chada, you invert the letters and it spells echad. So Aramaic is sometimes like Hebrew, just jumbled around. If you say Beit Shammai has 2, but Hillel only has 1, hachanami tarte ninhu. No, he also has 2. In other words, the reason that we need a second argument is because Beit Shammai gave us 2 reasons, and it would be insufficient for Hillel simply to argue on the merit of one case, right? Of one argument. So Hillel also needs a second argument. I'll get your hand in a moment, Audrey. We'll just finish this short paragraph. And if you say that there, Beit Shammai cite 2 reasons, and here Beit Hillel only offers 1, therefore Beit Hillel said there are 2 reasons here too. Okay, and now that's why they say the second argument. When a frequent and an infrequent practice coincide, the frequent practice takes precedence. So the Gemara is explaining that you might think that Hillel's first argument is so good that there is no need for a second argument, but in fact, this will allow you to rebut Shammai, who provided you with 2 rationales for his way of doing things. So Hillel also has 2. That's all. Audrey. Oh, unmute, please.
Thought I did, but didn't work. Okay. Nope. It occurred to me along those lines, what happens if Shabbat or Pesach occurs the first or second Seder on Shabbat? Would you say the Shabbat blessings first? Because it's the frequent?
Indeed. Though the way the Jewish tradition works through that is by modifying the Kiddush to include lines for Shabbat. So when Seder falls on a Friday night, you do the same order, you do the Hillel order, you bless over the wine, and then you do what we call the long Kiddush. But in the Kiddush, there are a number of phrases where, in addition to sanctifying the day of Pesach, you add in a phrase or 2 acknowledging the day of Shabbat. And in those phrases, the Sabbath always comes before Pesach. Okay. All right, so if you go through it, the next time you have to lead a Seder on Shabbos, check it out. And you'll notice that for all of the Shabbos inserts, what my good friend Roger Weisberg calls the Szechuan passages, because they're sometimes written in red.
Yeah.
on the Chinese menu, right? They all come before. You say Shabbat and the festival of unleavened bread, or Shabbat and the festival of Sukkot. Shabbat and it's always Shabbat first.
Okay.
For exactly that reason, Audrey. Yes, it is the same Hillelian argument of the regular taking precedence over the irregular in Jewish practice. Okay, so again, now the Gemara has an opportunity to change the subject, but it won't. It's like, no, we're not done with this yet. So now a Tosefta, another Mishnaic era teaching. Halakha kedivrei Beit Hillel. So the halakha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. Shita. And you have some of you know the word Peshat. If you're a regular student of Torah, Peshat means the simple sense. So Pshita means, yeah, obviously. That's simple. Pshita. Yeah, of course. Why would the Talmud declare that when it says that the halakha is in accordance with Hillel, Pshita? Of course it is. Simply. For the same reason that without even studying the passage, two people raised their hand at the beginning of today's class and said, of course Hillel's opinion is right. Because we know that Hillel's opinion is always right. I say always, asterisk. There are very few, which are really bizarre cases, which are interesting to study when Hillel is not the prevailing opinion. But 99% of the time, Hillel prevails. So, of course, it's Pshita. We know this. We know that Hillel always wins, so you don't even need to tell us that the halakha goes according to Hillel. It's, as it were, intuitively obvious. But nothing in the Gemara is intuitively obvious. So the Gemara comments, it is obvious that this is so. That's how they translate Pshita. Obviously. And why? Deha nefak bat kol. Because once upon a time, a voice came out of the heavens and declared that the halakha goes according to Hillel. Now, some of you are hearing a very distant bell jangling in the back of your mind. Wait a minute, a divine voice proclaiming that Hillel is right. Our very first Talmud class studied this passage. The very first time we leapt out of Pirkei Avot and said, okay, we've studied Mishnah, you've developed some good skills for reading this text, let's go into the deep end of the pool, let's study Gemara. That was 2 years ago, I think. I don't know, a year and a half. I'm a year ago, something like that. All I know is that today is Talmud session number 28 with liberal breaks when we're not studying. So 27 classes ago, we studied a passage from Tractate Eruvin, from the Eruv, the boundary that designates private and public domain in Jewish life and for Jewish religious practice, traveling on Shabbat and holidays and whatnot. And we studied this incredible story where two rabbis are in an argument and one uses all sorts of supernatural phenomena to prove his point. He's like, if I'm right, let this carob tree over here prove that I'm right. And the carob tree uproots itself and lands many cubits away. And everybody is impressed with the miracle, but not persuaded by the argument. He says, so what? You can't prove anything from a carob tree, and let this river prove it. And the river bends the other way. And let the walls of the Beit Midrash itself prove it, and the walls begin to cave in. And finally, Rabbi Joshua stands up and says, and then a voice from heaven comes down and says, the opinion is according to Hillel already. New? Don't you get it? God likes Hillel better than Shammai. That's when Rabbi Joshua stands up, and the walls of the Beit Midrash are still precariously close to falling. And he says, Lo b'shamayim hi. The halakha is not in the heavens. He's quoting a line from the book of Deuteronomy that we actually recite here at WRT on the morning of Yom Kippur. So the critical Yom Kippur morning reading. Lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in the heavens anymore. You want to talk about lived Jewish practice, deciding Jewish law? That was given over to humanity. That was given over to the rabbis. God does not have the authority to decide halakha. We started with this at the beginning of our Talmud lesson because it's an extraordinary comment that reverberates throughout all of Jewish life to this very day. It's not the only statement that matters, but it's one of the, I believe, the Lo b'shamayim hi is one of the core statements of Jewish doctrine. That God does not have final say in what Jewish law is. Okay, so now back to today's passage. They're saying, well, it's obvious that Hillel prevails because a bat kol came down and actually said, I am the voice of God. Hillel is right. Okay. Let's see where this goes. Why was it necessary? So the divine voice emerged and proclaimed that the halakha is always in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel. Why then was it necessary for the Tosefta to state that in this particular case, the halakha is in accordance with their opinion? That's the Peshita, right? Isn't it obvious? If we know before we even study the passage that Hillel's going to be right, why bother to say that Hillel's right? All right. The answer? The Gemara answers, if you wish, you can say that this Tosefta was taught before the divine voice emerged and proclaimed that principle. He's like, well, maybe the explanation is that this happened before the bat kol. Literally, bat kol means a daughter of a voice, but it's a conventional rabbinic way of referring to like when God intervenes in a human discussion. A bat kol comes down and says, this is the word of God speaking. So one argument is, well, maybe this all happened before that whole bat kol business in Eruvin. Chronology is never clear, and nor is it clear that chronology even matters, by the way. But so one argument is that we didn't have that whole business about the bat kol yet. Therefore, we had to state that the opinion goes according to Hillel on the merits of Hillel's arguments alone, not because God likes Hillel. All right? But of course, that's not going to be the end of the conversation. The iba'et ema, or you might say, but this is a Talmudic formula, or you could say the iba'et ema, this is Aramaic, le'achar bat kol, after the bat kol, the Rabbi Yehoshua when Rabbi Yehoshua got up to say, de Amar, saying, ein mashgichin bevat kol, we don't rely on a bat kol. Right? Remember, the bat kol does not get the last word in the argument in Eruvin. The voice from heaven comes down and says, why are you folks arguing? Clearly the opinion follows Hillel. It was Joshua who stood up and says, Lo b'shamayim, we don't care what the bat kol says. Thank you, God, but stay out of it. This is for the rabbis to decide. Extraordinary chutzpah here. Just extraordinary, which I love. Okay, so and the word here, by the way, for we do not trust the authority or rely, you're going to love this word. Mashgichin. Anyone know what a mashgiach is? Who is a mashgiach in Jewish life? Yeah, Steve, unmute yourself to say it.
The slaughterer, the kosher slaughterer.
No, not the slaughterer, but
The kosher slaughterer, no?
No. It doesn't have to be the slaughter. Who is it?
The guy who looks at it.
The
Who
inspector.
Guy who
oversees
looks
it.
at it.
Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
the shochet is the slaughterer, but the mashgiach is the one who inspects the kashrut of the slaughter.
Right.
Right, so my friend Adam Baldachin, who's the rabbi of Sharei Tikva in Scarsdale, the conservative shul, is also the mashgiach at Ben's Kosher Deli, which I understand closed. So maybe he was. There's a new kosher deli in Ardsley, by the way.
It's Liebman's is very old. It was first formed in 1953 in Riverdale.
But it's new in Ardsley. Yeah, they just opened
Yes,
one
we were
up.
there. It's delicious. We were there.
Okay, I hear it's good. They just opened up like near the Sawmill River Drive Road. Cool. So a mashgiach, a kosher establishment needs a mashgiach to come in and make sure that it's kosher. We had a mashgiach at WRT last week for a JNF event. So we had to kosher the whole building, the whole kitchen, to serve kosher food to a wide community from across the Jewish community. Excuse me. Okay, so in other words, he says, "Ein mashgichin bevat kol." A bat kol is not able to supervise whether or not a matter is kosher. Love that. We don't trust the mashgiach standard of a bat kol. All right, moving on. All right. Now you could, and that's what's said here. If you wish, say instead that the statement was indeed issued after the bat kol, or accept the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, who said that one disregards a divine voice. All right. Now, so that's all of that. Now we're ready to move on. Matane. So another Mishnah. So that's just the flow of a page of Talmud, right? We started with Mishnah and then Gemara. and then Mishnah, and then Gemara. So Mishnah, Matane. Heviu lefanav. So this is fascinating. We've gotten so far as the first cup of wine, right? If you're one of those people who tracks the order of the steps of the Seder by chanting the melody, Kadesh Urchatz, Kahar Pahas, Yahachatz, Magid, Rachatza, Motzi, Mahatza. It's a mnemonic for remembering where you are and telling the kids, nope, sorry, there's still 27 steps to go before you get to eat. No, it's not. It'll never be 27. There are only 14 of these, 14 or 15. Kadesh. So we did Kadesh, sanctification. Urchatz. Interestingly, it doesn't include the urchatz, which means washing of hands. But the assumption is that if you are sanctifying the day and you're about to eat something, you need to purify your hands. Not removing schmutz. It's not a 6 minutes scrub for going into an OR. It's about ritual, entering the Seder in a state of ritual purity. So kadesh urchatz, kahar pas. All right, so what's the first thing we eat at a Seder? What's the first hors d'oeuvre?
Parsley.
Parsley, the green herb.
Right.
We're going to find out in a moment that in Mishnaic times, this is not as simple as it seems. We have a very clearly delineated Seder ritual, and we, I'm going to say we're mostly Ashkenazi Jews, know that karpas is a green vegetable. Typically something herbaceous, though it doesn't actually say what karpas is. And there are lots of different things that can be used as karpas. Any green vegetable associated with spring. I mean, I've never seen you use a cucumber, but you really could. You could use asparagus for karpas. Typically, we use parsley because it kind of like has a very distinctive flavor. So it kind of imprints a memory, and it's easily dipped in salt water. But we're going to see that the word parsley and even the word karpas doesn't appear, I think, in the forthcoming paragraph. But we're talking about karpas because everyone knows that karpas is the first thing you eat. Now, this is good practice for next week. Those of you especially who are leading the Seder, what blessing or blessings are recited over karpas?
Adama.
Adama. Thank you, Barbara. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri ha'adama. And then you dip the parsley in the salt water and you eat. Borei peri ha'adama means the one who creates the fruit of the ground. So you're eating a vegetable that grows out of the ground, right? Tree fruits are not karpas. But asparagus could be, parsley. Kelly doesn't love parsley, so we usually use cilantro in our house. Some people really don't like cilantro. They think it tastes like soap. That's apparently a genetic thing. So it's a divisive vegetable. Barbara, thought or comment here?
Why urchatz, washing hands, you don't say a blessing?
Yeah, right? Interesting, because it's not a commanded activity. Right? There is no commandment to wash your hands.
But later on in the Seder, there is a blessing.
Later there is.
The second one.
Because when the Pesach was served, when the Paschal lamb would have been served in temple times, there's a lot of things we do at the Seder where the thing isn't actually there. The thing being the namesake of the holiday, the Pesach, the roasted lamb. That's the essence of Pesach. It's even called the Pesach, and it's the one thing you davka don't do. Davka is a great modern Hebrew word that means, wouldn't you know?
On purpose.
Yeah, or on purpose. You don't eat a lamb. Sephardic Jews do, though. Ashkenazim don't, because they feel like we shouldn't be dining on Passover lamb until the temple is rebuilt. We'll get to all of this. If we don't get to it today, we'll get to it 2 weeks. So, all right. So you've got your karpas ready to go, and the blessing we're going to say is Borei Pri Ha'adama. All right. Trivia question: is any other blessing recited over the karpas? You got a 50% chance with a yes or a no here. All right, the answer is no. Unlike maror, when you dine on maror, a little bit, just another couple steps later on in the Seder, right? It's kadesh urchatz, wash your hands. Kahar pahas, dip the vegetable. Yahachatz, break the matzah. Magid, tell the story. Rachatza, get ready to eat by washing your hands ritually, like with a blessing. Mohotzihi mahatza, then you make the motzi. Maror, eat the bitter herb. Korech, make a Hillel sandwich. Shulchan or horech, serve the festival meal. Safun, distribute the afikomen. Barech, say a blessing of Hallel afterwards. Ha-lehel, sorry, that's Barech is Birkat Hamazon. Ha-lehel is Hallel. Nihirtza, wrap it up. That's the stages of the Seder. That's why that song is very helpful. Okay, so Kadesh we've done. That's the whole Hillel Shammai business. Urchatz isn't even mentioned, but the assumption is wash your hands before you start playing with your parsley. Okay, so now we're at Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas. Okay, so back to Karpas. With Karpas, the only blessing you say is Borei Pri Ha'adama. Thank you, God, for creating the fruit of the ground. Time to eat the parsley. Whereas with Maror, there are two blessings you say. And similarly with crying out loud with these it's ridiculous. Can't wait to watch the YouTube. Okay. Motzi matzah is actually two blessings. You say the motzi, but you also have to say al achilat matzah, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu. It's a mitzvah blessing. B'mitzvotav vitzivanu al achilat matzah. Blessed is the one, sovereign, etc., who sanctified our lives with mitzvot and commanded us to eat this matzah. It's not just a motzi who brings forth bread from the earth. It is, and this is a commanded food that you must eat. And we're going to get into, I'm not sure today, but there's a passage on, well, what is it? What do you mean eat? Is it enough if I just swallow the matzah? Do I have to chew it? That we're going to get into that. So matzah actually takes two blessings. Maror also takes two blessings, right? We've already said Borei Pri Ha'adama, which applies to all the vegetables that you eat at Passover. You with me on this? Because you don't have to say a blessing every time you eat a new foodstuff if the blessing you say at the outset covers you, right? So if you're just having a meal, let's say you're having a regular Shabbos dinner. When you say motzi, you're covered for all the foods on the table. All right? That's why you say motzi before the meal. You don't have to say Borei Pri Ha'adama when you eat cauliflower as part of your Shabbos meal. Right? Motzi covers you. Brings forth bread from the earth, covers everything else you're going to eat that night. But at a Pesach Seder, you have to eat something before you make motzi. You have to eat some green vegetables, so you have a specific blessing for the vegetable, but you still aren't covered for the rest of the meal. So then you say the motzi. Now you're covered for anything else you're going to eat. So when you get to Maror, you should think, hey, I can just eat this. I've now said motzi. And by the way, I already said Borei Pri Ha'adama, so I'm definitely covered for a horseradish root. Or, as was the case in the time the Gemara was written, a bitter lettuce. And that's going to be really important. Okay, their maror was a green herb also. That's why I said this gets a little bit confusing. Some of you have Seder plates with 5 spots, and some of you have Seder plates with 6 spots. That's what this is about. In the Sephardic world, the bitter herb is like arugula or endive or radicchio or some kind of like, spring lettuce. Watercress makes a great maror, but they call it chazeret, which means lettuce. And it does double duty. It can be a karpas, which is a Greek word that simply means a vegetable. So it's a karpas in the sense that it is a symbol of spring and it's the first taste, but it does double duty that it's also maror. But since so many Jews who observe Seder today have ancestry that traces itself through centuries and centuries of Ashkenazi Jewish life in cold parts of Europe, we didn't have spring lettuces. So we used a horseradish root, which has a different kind of bitterness, right? It's bitter, but not in the same way that watercress is bitter. But your taste buds can tell the difference, but we just use bitter as an inclusio It's all bitter herbs, but horseradish bitter is very different from watercress bitter, to my taste buds anyway. Like one makes your nose go on fire and one doesn't. So Ashkenazi Jews think that no, maror is parain, right? That's the real bitter herb. But our Sephardic friends, our Mizrahi friends from the Middle East who don't have horseradish root, they just use bitter lettuce. And you can have 5 spots on the table where the lettuce does double duty as karpas and bitter herb, or you can have 6. All right, so that explains the wonkiness, and you need to know that before we read more Gemara today. But the point that I wanted to make originally was that there is no additional blessing for karpas. It's just borei pri hadama. It's a thing you eat, but it's not a commanded food, interestingly. Whereas maror and matzah are commanded to eat those specific foods, so you need a second blessing. For matzah, it's alachilat matzah. And for maror, it's alachilat maror, who commands us concerning the eating of maror. You're not just eating maror because it's food, you're eating it because it's part of the Seder experience. You follow me here? Okay. And where's Charoset in all of this? We're getting there. All right. I'm either going to like really help our Seder leaders or really confuse the hell out of you today. Like, you're going to be swimming in like, wait a minute. What did Blake say about this? Then you can go back and watch the YouTube. Okay. So, matine. Heviu lifanav, which is really funny. It literally means they brought before him. Well, what did they bring before him? And who's they? Probably the waitstaff. If you really want to get specific, probably slaves who were employed in the kitchen. Presuming that this meal was to be conducted in the kind of Roman triclinium, very elaborate meal format, they would have staff. So first they bring him the cup, they mix the cup of wine. Now they bring before him, and it says, mivatel b'chazeret. So you take the chazeret and you do a dipping with it. Ad shemagia leparperet hapat. This is a very confusing statement. We're going to look at how Steinsaltz translates it. The attendants brought vegetables before him, meaning the leader of the Seder, prior to the meal, if there were no other vegetables on the table. So another way to do this is you could just have a plate of crudité, which is legit to have on your Seder table before the meal even begins. And many people do. He dips the chazeret, which is, again, the bitter lettuce, but just think of it as lettuce, okay? Because in this case, it's karpas. It's functioning as just karpas. He dips the chazeret into, you notice it says water or vinegar. It doesn't even say what they dip it into. It just says mivatel b'chazeret. You dip the lettuce. Well, we're all used to salt water, but many Jews from like Iraq, Syria, the Middle East, North Africa prefer vinegar, even to this day. So, and that is because that's just their regional custom. But this was probably just from the, ancient eating customs of the Mediterranean, where food gets dipped a lot. And any of you go out to a Middle Eastern restaurant and not order the dips, you're missing out. That's like, you have to order the dips. Dipping food is part of Mediterranean dining culture. And in this case, whether it was a salty condiment, salt water is very basic. And of course, it is the thing that most reminds us of tears. And these foods go beyond their culinary value for us. They are part of the storytelling of Pesach. But just as a culinary tradition, you can also dip lettuce in vinaigrette. We call that salad. Right? So this is the salad course. All right. So they're explaining what happens at this point. So you take the chazeret, you dip it in order to taste some food before he reaches the dessert of the bread, which is the parperet hapat. Pat is like pita. Pat, a slice, right? Parperet, dessert of the bread is a little bit weird. I would say the traditional condiment for the bread, which on Pesach is maror, right? Remember, it's not bread, it's matzah, but matzah is bread. All matzah is bread, not all bread is matzah. That is why the blessing over matzah, first and foremost, is motzi. For all 7, or if you observe 8 days of Pesach, anytime you serve a matzah sandwich or matzah brai, you say motzi, because matzah is bread. It's just unleavened bread. And the parperet hapa in this case is the main condiment for your matzah is maror, is the bitter herb, right? That's the main flavor of the Pesach meal. It's the thing you have to eat. Whereas karpas is a thing that becomes part of the ritual, but there's no mitzvah to eat karpas. That's why I was asking all of this stuff about 2 blessings or 1. When you eat karpas, it's just borei pri adama. Thanks for the grub. Thanks for the green herb. It grew out of the ground. Yay. Whereas with maror, you have to say, thank you for the commandment to eat maror. Maror is a commanded food. Karpas is just part of the tradition. You have to eat the maror. You must taste it. All right. Heviu lefanav matzah v'chazeret v'charoset u'shnei tavshilin. And then what happens is they bring out matzah and the bitter and the lettuce and charoset and 2 cooked dishes, which correspond to the 2 roasted foods on the Seder plate. One is the shank bone, and the other is the egg, which is supposed to represent the festival offering. Everybody thinks, oh, eggs, springtime. It actually refers to the fact that on Pesach, there were 2 commanded meat offerings. There's the Pesach, which was the Paschal lamb, and then some other roasted meat. Could be chicken, could be not traditionally fish. Egg is a good substitute, and it's springtime, rebirth, life, all that. But the point is that 2 roasted dishes. So now we can see all the essential pieces of the meal in front of the leader. Af al pi she'ein charoset mitzvah. And you bring out these foods even though charoset is not a mitzvah, right? So charoset is the other food which, like karpas, you can eat it, but there's no blessing to say, thou hast commanded us to eat the charoset. Familiar? Right? I mean, as you go through, think through your Seder, which is coming up, or if you don't believe me now, wait till Monday night. You're not going to say a blessing for the mitzvah of eating charoset because it's not a mitzvah. It's part of the ritual, but it's not a commanded activity. Mom and Dad.
Since Charoset is the only object that requires preparation, is there a recipe or what Charoset was supposed to consist of? I mean, I know it's a lot of different interpretations culturally, but where is it laid down that you're supposed to put, apples and nuts and honey and cinnamon and all that other stuff together?
In Pesachim 114 A and B. That's where. In other words, in this passage, we just haven't gotten there yet. So stick around. Okay, so you serve charoset even though it's not a mitzvah. Nancy, is that your hand?
Yeah, I always thought you're supposed to have the Hillel sandwich. So you're not commanded to, you just have the sandwich.
We're going to get into Hillel sandwich too. We haven't gotten past karpas, right? I'm just laying out, I'm giving you a real review of all the things you need for a Seder. And by the way, the Seder ritual is not what's being described here exactly. Not the way we do it. Exactly, but it's close. All right. Rabbi Eliezer ben Sadok Omer. So now we've gotten this far. We know that Charoset is eaten at Pesach, but it's not a mitzvah to eat it. You're not commanded to, you just do. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Sadok Omer, mitzvah. He says, no, it is a commandment. Charoset is a must eat, not a may eat, but must eat. Uve mikdash hayu mevi'in lefanav gufo shel Pesach. And it is added here by the Talmud. And uve mikdash, literally when the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was standing, hayu mevi'in, they would bring before the Seder leader, gufo shel Pesach, the body of the Pesach. In other words, the lamb. But only when the temple was standing. Nowadays, we don't do, as I said before, davka, the one thing that we identify with the holiday, the slaughter and serving of the roasted lamb, that is not something you're supposed to do. At least some Jews think that. Though the Sephardim say, no, lamb is because Sephardim love lamb. But I've never been to an Ashkenazi Seder where lamb was on the menu. It's not traditional, even though it's exactly the thing the Torah commands. Okay. So in some places in the Jewish world, it's taboo to serve lamb on Pesach, and in some places, it's the only thing you would think of serving. But I have never been to a Seder in Morocco. But it would be conventional there. And in parts where, in parts of the world where lamb is the staple meat, definitely you would eat lamb on Pesach. Michelle.
Only the best lamb I ever ate was at a second night Seder at an Israeli family's
There you go.
thing. And then not figuring it out one year, a few years later, I said, geez, shouldn't we be eating lamb?
Yeah.
So I made it instead of brisket. Then I said, okay, and we went back to brisket. I mean, it was good, but.
I happen to love lamb. It's sort of like cilantro. It's a very love or hate. People have a love-hate relationship with these foods. Okay. So, by the way, this was not resolved. Rabbi Eliezer ben Sadok, who says it is a mitzvah to eat charoset. So that opinion just stays there as part of the conversation. Is it a mitzvah? Is it not a mitzvah? We don't know. Let's read on. Now we're in 114b. Gemara. All right, so back to the Gimel Mem, Gemara. Later writing. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said, Zot omeret mitzvot tzrichot kavanot. This all goes to show you, Zot omeret, this is to say, that mitzvot require intention. All right, so this is a very interesting, he's kind of like zooming the lens back to make a kind of like a meta comment. He's like, wait a minute. I want to make something very clear to you. It's not just about observing the practice. What makes it important, or what the important thing is that you do it intentionally, like you're thinking about fulfilling a mitzvah. Kevan de la ba'idan chiyuva de maror hu be'achele. You can hear we're in Aramaic. So the proof of this from the Mishnah is that since one does not eat the lettuce at the time of his obligation to eat bitter herbs, he eats it only after reciting one blessing. Right? We said this, by the way. You start with eating lettuce. That's their karpas. You don't wait until maror to eat some lettuce, right? Again, you have to remember that in ancient times, lettuce did double duty. It was both something you would eat at the beginning of the Seder, it's your salad course, but it also functions later on as the maror. So when you eat it at the beginning, your intention is, I'm having salad. I'm fulfilling a karpas mitzvah just to get some flavor in my mouth, but I'm not yet fulfilling the mitzvah of maror. In order to fulfill the mitzvah of maror, I have to apply the correct intention that now I'm eating the lettuce 20 minutes later or 40 or 80 minutes later, depending on how long your Seder is, specifically for the purpose of fulfilling a mitzvah. But at the beginning, the only blessing I say is I'm creating the fruit of the ground. And clearly the reason is that perhaps he did not intend to fulfill his obligation to eat bitter herbs. And therefore he needs to dip it again for the purpose of bitter herbs, only the second time so we all know this, the first time you dip in salt water. The second time, what do you dip?
In the Charoset.
You dip in the Charoset. And again, we Ashkenazi Jews have this figured out differently than what the Mishnah, the Gemara is proposing here. Because we have two separate vegetables. We have parsley or something green to go into the salt water and horseradish for the Charoset. Two dips. All right. But in ancient times, if the lettuce was doing double duty, you need to apply the correct intention to why you are eating that lettuce. At the beginning, it's just salad. We say it fulfills the karpas custom, but remember, karpas isn't a mitzvah. It's just part of the ritual. You're just eating salad. We say it's about tasting the tears, but no, it's your salad course. Because you got a long way to go. You got a lot of story to tell here, which is interesting that the Talmud doesn't care about the story. It cares about fulfilling the letter of the law with everything else. Okay. And by the way, it does care about the story, but it does not provide you the script. It provides you the questions. We looked at that last year at Pesach time. We looked at it's just one more page down in the Talmud. All right. So when he ate it as karpas, he wasn't thinking, no intention to eat bitter herb. Later, when he dips it in the Charoset, he says a special blessing, ala chilat maror, and it becomes that lettuce now functions very differently. Therefore, a mitzvah requires the proper intention. You could be doing the exact same thing with your body. I am eating lettuce. But in the first case, I'm just eating lettuce and it's karpas. In the second case, I'm fulfilling the specific mitzvah of eating a bitter or herb to observe Pesach. You get the argument here? Okay. For it could enter your mind that mitzvot do not require intent. So why would you need 2 dippings? But he's only dipped the lettuce once, and he wasn't fulfilling a mitzvah the first time. Because there's no Vitzivanu prayer. There's no Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav Vitzivanu ala chilat karpas. The only blessing for karpas is Borei Pri Ha'adama. It's not a mitzvah to eat it. It's just a thing you do. Okay. Mimai. The Gemara is still not satisfied that it's made its case. So it says, okay, mimai. How so? From where? How do you know this? Dilma. Because perhaps leolam mitzvot ein tzrichot kavana. Maybe mitzvot never really require proper intention. Maybe that's not the thing. Maybe it's not about what you're thinking. It's just the doing. Okay. Udeka'amara tre tibule lamali. And that which you said, why do I need 2 dippings? Perhaps the reason is so that there should be a conspicuous distinction for the children. So this is a very interesting reason that it's not about, you don't identify the mitzvah for the sake of, or you don't need the intention to make the mitzvah count. What really matters is that you're simply doing something that is outside the norms of eating practice, which will stimulate the interest of kids. The entire Pesach ritual is actually about getting kids to pay attention to something and getting kids to ask questions organically. The 4 questions, the script for the questions, is not really what the rabbis think the essence of the ritual is. The question should just happen. So there are a lot of things that we're doing so that a kid would naturally ask, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halilot. Why is this night different? How? What's going? Not so much why is it different, but this is really different. Why? Like, why are you doing all these things? Why are you dipping your food in these weird ways? Like, why are we eating these foods? What's with the reclining to the left? What's with the, what are the other ones? Ben Yoshvinu, Vein Misubin. Why most nights do we have, maror? Like most nights it's just broccoli night. Why do we have to eat these weird bitter lettuces?
Well, the other question is, why on all other nights do we dip once and tonight we dip twice? You're talking about dipping.
Right. Exactly. Well, that is the, afilu pa'am echat, halayla hazeh shtei fa'amim. All of the nights, it's just once. Tonight, we're doing all this crazy dipping. We had our salad course, but now we're doing another dipping. We're taking the lettuce again, and now we're putting it in this other weird pasty substance. What's the deal? So one is suggesting that it's not so much what you're thinking when you're doing these mitzvot, it's the fact of doing them that creates the experience for the sake of kids to ask questions so that you can say, aha, it was with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And now you tell the whole story. Let's go all the way back. It's like, oh, you really want to know? All right, boy chick, I'm going to tell you. Buckle up, it's going to be 45 minutes. Our people were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then the story begins. And for that, there is a script. But the rabbis in the Talmud make it very clear that the script is not the thing. Getting the kids to ask questions is the thing. And that's why we want to pay attention to this passage in the Gemara. Barbara.
Well,
Barbara's an educator, so she gets this.
My question is, where did all these blessings come about?
Early, maybe even pre-Mishnaic, it's clear that by the time the Mishnah is written, the rabbis already have a codified tradition of blessings that has been made into a sidur, a prayer book. So where
after the temple was destroyed?
Maybe. I'm not an expert enough in the history of liturgy to know exactly when the Baruch Atah Adonai formula was developed and then adopted as the building block of Jewish prayer. But it's very, very early in the rabbinic period, or maybe even pre-rabbinic. It's obviously not in the Torah, so we know that, but it's all over the earliest rabbinic literature. So somewhere in there, the custom was developed and adopted. Audrey, unmute.
When you talk about stimulating the children to ask questions, doesn't that get to the whole point of the tradition of having the Seder and reliving this year after year after year? So
Sorry,
that
say it again.
Okay, when you talk about stimulating the children to ask the questions, in other words, that's the point really of the whole Seder. Doesn't that pertain to every generation should act as if they too left Egypt?
Yes,
In other words, tradition,
yes.
preserving the knowledge and the experience.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay. All right, I'm gonna skip a bunch so that we're now jumping, but it's all, then there's a very long discussion that continues along similar lines. It just keeps unpacking and unpacking and unpacking. So this will not feel like we're digressing. So we're now on 115a. It's the next page. Bisuria, which is Syria, Avdi Kerav Huna. In Syria, they act in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna. And Rav Sheshet, son of Rav Yoshua, acted in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda. So they're saying, all I want to point out is that even the Gemara acknowledges that there are different regional customs around and the previous part was like, what are the vegetables that you can eat? And can you eat rice? And are beets okay? And what do you do if you don't have more than one kind of lettuce? Like, okay. The halakha goes on is in accordance with Rav Chisda. The Gemara relates that Rav Acha, son of Rava, would seek other vegetables in order to preclude himself from taking sides in the dispute. It's like, I'm just going to have a whole crudité platter so that I don't have to be accused of taking one side or the other. Moving on. Now we get to the next major appetizer, right? Amar Ravina said, Amar li Rav Misharshia, Bere Rav Natan. So Ravina said that Rav Misharshia, son of Rav Natan, said to me that Hillel said as follows. So there's a remembered teaching by Hillel. Hachi Amar Hillel Mishame di Gemara. So literally Hillel was citing a Gemara, but not the Gemara. He was citing a tradition. La nichroch inish matza umaror behade hada de v'nechol, which is a really weird thing to attribute to Hillel. What is it? He ruled that a person should not wrap matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them. So one rabbi remembers a Hillel teaching, and he said, Hillel taught you do not combine matzah and bitter herbs together. By the way, you've done some seders before. Will this rabbi's opinion be accepted? No. In fact, Davka, of all things, the sandwich that bears Hillel's name is exactly this sandwich, right? When they say wrap, but the word is combine, right? Nichroch, from korech. So let's take a look. Okay, so we have this tradition that Hillel actually said, don't do that. Don't make my sandwich. He ruled in this manner because he maintains that today, after the destruction of the temple, the obligation to eat matzah applies by Torah law, whereas the obligation to eat bitter herbs without a paschal lamb applies only by rabbinic law. So this rabbi says, look, the problem with the so-called Hillel sandwich is matzah is definitely from the Torah, whereas bitter herbs, which would have been eaten as the kind of condiment for the lamb, that's a rabbinic ruling. That's his view. And if one were to wrap them together, the bitter herbs whose obligation applies by rabbinic law would come and nullify the matzah whose obligation applies by Torah law. It's like you can't mix a rabbinic law and a Torah law. That's this one rabbi's opinion. Again, don't get too obsessed over this because he's going to get negged. He's going to get rejected. And even according to the one who says that mitzvot do not nullify each other. So even if you believe that this is kind of crazy, this idea that a rabbinic edict and a Torah edict could cancel each other if you somehow combine them, even if you say that that isn't a thing, that principle applies only to a mixture of food, of one food whose obligation applies by Torah law with another food whose obligation applies by Torah law, or to a mixture of one food whose obligation applies by rabbinic law with another food whose obligation applies by rabbinic law. However, in a case of a mixture of one food whose obligation applies by Torah law with another food whose obligation applies by rabbinic law, the food whose obligation applies by rabbinic law comes and nullifies the food. So they're just restating the argument. All right. The Gemara then says, who is this Tana that you heard say? Where are you getting this from? What tradition is this? That mitzvot do not nullify each other. It is Hillel himself, who, as it was taught in a Baraita, they said about Hillel that he, in fact, would do this very thing. So whatever he said about it, there's another tradition that says, no, this was Hillel's favorite sandwich. He would wrap matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them. As it is stated, they shall eat it, meaning the Passover sacrifice, the Pesach, with matzot and bitter herbs, which indicates that you should be eating these together. So welcome to how Talmud argues. Like, it's exhausting. I was up until 1 a.m. reading this last night just to refresh myself and getting like brain fog. It might have been because it was 1 a.m. and I mentioned that I had that glass of Spanish white, which was delicious. Okay. I want to get just to a minute about the Charoset, because believe it or not, this argument goes on for another 5 paragraphs. Let's see. All right, here we go. Now we are getting to all of the big appetizers, the required appetizers before you start the meal. So at the very bottom of this page of Gemara, Rav Papa said, learn from this halakha, which requires the washing of hands, that for this lettuce on Pesach, now they're talking about lettuce in the function of bitter herb, lettuce as maror, one must submerge it first in charoset. Why? If charoset is not a commanded food, why would you take the bitter herb and dip it? I mean, we know we do this, but why? Rav Papa's argument is that you do it due to the bitterness and the poison in the lettuce. Now, it's not poison in the sense of it's going to kill you, but it's that thing that your body reacts to and says, ooh, this is a very strong flavor. I'm not sure I want to eat this. You know, we talk about like you can cut the bitter herb with charoset. You put it in something sweet, which makes the bitterness more palatable. Human palate is fascinating. I read several years ago that we're the only organisms that develop cravings for foodstuffs that evolved specifically these compounds to be deterrents from being eaten. So the classic example is human beings are the only organisms that crave eating spicy peppers. And some people get really into this. I know that there are people probably on this Zoom who can't stand spicy peppers. I happen to like them. But you don't eat a raw jalapeno or a raw Scotch bonnet pepper. I mean, that's a real masochist. So human beings crave interesting tasting foods. I happen to love bitter tasting things, but generally not on their own. Like, I'm not going to go home last night and pour myself a nice tall glass of Campari. That's not my jam. The bitterness I find overpowering. But a Campari in a Negroni is delightful. So the idea of cutting the bitterness, they'll refer to it as poison, and maybe it is, but that's not really the point. The point is that it's the thing that makes it taste bad is also the essential flavor that you need to eat. And that's what the rabbis are wrestling with. It's like, well, wait a minute. I have to taste something bitter because slavery. But it's horrible. It makes my nose go nuts and I'm, gushing mucus all over the Seder table. How unpleasant is that? Barbara?
How about when you cut regular white horseradish with beets?
Exactly. That's exactly right, by the way. Some people think that that's
But
when
would
they
somebody that was Orthodox, or would they be eating horseradish with beets?
Yeah, it's legit because you have right here in the Gemara this tradition of cutting the bitterness. So it's baked into the tradition, as it were, or dipped into the tradition. So you submerged your bitter lettuce. So you don't eat a mouthful of raw, like what's the bitterest lettuce? Dandelion greens. They're horrible. I hate them. They're too bitter for me. If you saute them very, very slowly with onions and garlic, they become more palatable. But raw dandelion greens are awful bitter. But the point is that you want to taste something bitter, but you should cut it with the charoset. For if it could enter your mind that one need not thoroughly submerge the letter in the charoset, then why would I be washing my hands before eating the bitter herbs in the first place? He did not touch. The idea is that the liquid itself can transmit impurity too. So the washing of hands is required so that you don't transmit impurity through the liquid. It's not about the solid food. It's about the fact that you have to dip it. If you weren't dipping it, you wouldn't need to wash your hands. That's what the argument is here. It's a little cockeyed. The Gemara says, no, the Gemara rejects this. Actually, I'll say to you, according to the halakha, one need not submerge the lettuce in the charoset and the poison dies. So, no, you'll be fine. The poison is nullified from the very smell. Just putting charoset on the table will be enough to neutralize the offensiveness of the bitter herb. But if you're not dipping it, then why do I need to wash my hands? The Gemara answers, perhaps one will submerge the lettuce and therefore it isn't. Well, somebody's going to do it anyway. Okay. And it goes on. Rav Papa said, a person should not leave bitter herbs in the charoset for a lengthy period of time. If you're going to cut it, don't overdo it. The ratio of beets to horseradish or charoset to horseradish should favor horseradish, lest the sweetness of the spices in the charoset nullify the bitterness. And the bitter herbs require a bitter taste. In other words, he's saying what I just said. The whole point is to taste something bitter, right? Somebody who like puts a tiny little drop of maror and then gobs and gobs of charoset to like cover it up. Well, that's lovely, but you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Take it like a man, will you? No, I can't say that these days, but that's the idea, right? As you know, somebody's grandfather inevitably said, it puts hair on your chest. And as Kelly would have said, her grandfather said that all the time, and she would respond to her grandpa, but grandpa, I don't want hair on my chest. Okay. My dad is kind of a maror expert. He makes his own chrein. So what do you want to say about all this?
Well, I just remember from your grandmom Sally's Seders, when many of her brothers were alive, there was a contest to see who could tolerate the most grain. And of course, as you said, with noses running and snot blowing all over the table, my Uncle Meyer would say, it's borscht.
That's right. That's right. See? Okay. So this is where we have to end for today. We didn't yet get to what is the charoset recipe, but it is in there. It will talk about why apples. It will also talk about how you make it convincing that it looks like mortar. It will even go so far as to say you should put like fibers or threads of ginger in there to represent hay, the straw that was in the mortar, which doesn't combine well. So it's interesting. They had it does say apples, it doesn't say nuts, but almost every charoset recipe in all parts of the world where Jews have lived and thrived includes fruit and nuts and wine. Like those seem to be the core ingredients. Typical flavoring agents include cinnamon, is very popular, and ginger. Interestingly, less ginger in the Ashkenazi variants of charoset. But
How about honey?
Honey is also acceptable, though bee honey was not favored in antiquity. They probably, whenever the Bible talks about the land of milk and honey, it's probably talking about date honey, which is widely available in most Middle Eastern grocery stores, by the way. It's delicious. So I've made a charoset with date honey before. It's wonderful. I've also made charoset with pomegranate molasses, which is delicious and gives it this really lovely sweet tart flavor. So I mess around with ingredients because there is no halachic. Remember, charoset, there's a debate we looked at today is eating charoset even a mitzvah at all? The mitzvah is to eat the maror. A Charoset is there for the purpose of dipping the bitter herb. The dipping cuts the flavor of the maror to make it palatable, but you don't want it so palatable that you don't taste the bitterness. The dipping also is the conduit for ritual impurity through the liquid, which is why you wash the hands, right? So what we're really looking is the Gemara is not just telling us what to do, it's really explaining the why. The thing about Gemara is that it doesn't have a uniform opinion on why. It has lots of rabbis saying, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And that's where you can get really confused. So I've taken the liberty of kind of like cutting out a lot of the stuff. If you want to go back, go on Safaria and read all of Pesachim 114a, b, 115a, and we just started 115b, please be my guest before your Seder, but you might find it harder to actually lead a Seder. Like this material is great for a lot of things, but it's not great for figuring out what the hell do I say to my friends at the Seder this year. So that's what I want to end on. This shall be a Seder like no other, coming as it does at this time of terrible conflict and heartbreak for the Jewish people, a war that continues. You know, just days ago, our Israeli friends were sleeping in their safe rooms and bunkers because of the threat of Iranian projectiles coming into their communities. I'm blessed to have received a number of gifts this year. Yesterday, I received a couple of guests in my office. Anna Kislansky and David Bernstein are the director and deputy director of the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism. That's the reform movement in Israel. So they're like the counterparts to Rick Jacobs here in the States. So they really lead the whole reform movement in Israel. And their movement commissioned a number of rabbis living in Israel to write reflections and rituals and poems and readings to supplement your Seder. Some of these have been translated into English. And tomorrow, either tomorrow or Sunday, but I think tomorrow, my communications department at the temple will be mailing the congregation this supplement as a little Seder gift for you. Normally, I write my own prayer. This year, there are so many that have been written, and I want something around your Seder table that was written post-October 7th in Israel that expresses what Israelis are feeling right now, but that also opens up, you know, if indeed, I think it was Rav Eliezer in the passage we looked at today, is right that the whole point of Pesach is not to read from a script, but rather to get the youngest participants to ask meaningful questions. I hope that by beginning your Seder or by finding a way to include one or more of the readings that we're sending to you, you will achieve the overall objective, which is twofold. And if you take nothing else away from today, let's take two master learnings out of it. One, that, my God. I was getting to like this beautiful sermonic moment. One, that mitzvot require intention. So don't go through the ritual of the Seder on autopilot, especially not this year. Do go through it thinking deeply about what kind of conversation do you want to create. And two, that the highest aspiration for a Seder should be for people to ask really good questions, and not necessarily for you to make sure that you read every last word in your Haggadah. So that's my prayer for all of us. It would not be too much to wish for a Zisum Pesach, a Passover that is sweeter than the last 6 months have been. And a Seder that provides us with hope that we can say with full hearts, L'shana b'haba'a b'Yerushalayim. So, Zisum Pesach, everyone, Chag Sameach, and we meet again on May 2nd.
Great.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John.
Passover, everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Happy Passover to everyone in the group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sameach.
Pesach.